men are just trash. Keep them away from me. I'm Ella.
And I'm Kieran. Welcome to Impolite Company, the podcast in which we bring our black queer perspectives to some of the most interesting and pertinent DEI issues of the moment.
Join us as we laugh, cry and go deep on what topics are exciting us, as well as what's keeping us up at night. Hi everyone. Hi Kieran.
Hey. Hi everyone.
It's very unnerving that we're laughing at the beginning of this quite serious topic, but we've just spent the past 5 minutes trying to record the intro and now we've slightly got the giggles. So we're about to talk about something that doesn't give you the giggles. So welcome back to Impolite Company. This is going to be an interesting episode, I think, because we're talking about something which feels particularly acute at the moment. We're talking about the broad topic of toxic masculinity, but within that, the sort of epidemic, really, of violence against women that feels like it's dominating the headlines right now. And we're going to look at and explore and talk about what's behind this, what our own experiences have been, what we think is kind of driving this, what maybe we can do about it. But it's one of those topics where in my sort of research in advance, I sort of started pulling the thread and I was like, oh, and this thing and this other article that I read a couple of years ago is kind of related to this. And so, you know, I think it's a whole universe of things we could talk about. So we'll try and not yap for hours and hours, but I think there's a rich source of stuff to discuss here and to pull apart. So I guess as a sort of starting point, what's your kind of view, Kieran, on certainly the headlines at the moment? And for context, at the time of recording, we're looking at the trial in particular of Dominique Pellico in France, who's accused of drugging and raping and having a litany of other men rape his wife while she was unconscious over the course of a period of years. That's sort of main news story that's dominating the headlines, but there's a load of other ones that feel like they're in our collective consciousness at the moment. What's going on?
First of all, I think that this is the tip of the iceberg, and I think this is something that's always been happening. It's just that we are now seeing it more broadly, or it's now being reported on. So I think that there's more of a there's more appetite. Probably sounds like the wrong word to surface these things, and these things seem to go further in terms of, would this be an isolated incident that would have not have been pushed as hard by the media before some of these things? I think that's one thing. I also think this, again, is another example of where we have, I think, people consuming quite extremist content. And this is not necessarily the reason why, but I think the general normalization of quite extreme views, I think that it's having an impact on people carrying out maybe some of their fantasies or whatever, or feeling like that's something that's more normalized. I mean, we're seeing like a bunch of these crazy behaviors, predominantly from what we're seeing from men, and in most cases, women being kind of the subject of whatever they are feeling like they want to carry out and have the right to carry out based on whatever. I think there's a general increase because of this kind of extremist type views and the platforming of those things. I think we're seeing a spike in toxic masculinity being normalized in general. And for me, I think it's just like, it's really worrying when you hear the way that people, and it's not to say that this hasn't, like I said, I think this has been happening anyway, but I think we're being exposed to it more. And I think it's really worrying that people are in a place where they think they can just do literally whatever they want. And a society that is not all of society, but people being able to live in a pocket or in their own world that rewards them for those types of behaviours, or they see other people being rewarded for it.
There's an interesting sort of, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, there's an interesting sort of two obvious facets to this question are around, you know, this French court case is so, it's almost unfathomably monstrous, and part of what's unfathomably monstrous about it is how sort of everyday it is, how this woman is living in a small town in France, and she's been married to her husband, I think they had like almost childhood sweethearts. They've been together for decades, and she has absolutely no idea. Well, aside from there is some stuff around, she was having memory loss and she was going to the doctor, and there was a whole systemic thing that happened here where she was not being believed, or her situation was not being properly explored by the doctors that she was going to, right? She had multiple sexually transmitted diseases. So there's a patriarchal system that was shutting her up whilst she was feeling that something was amiss. But aside from feeling something was amiss, this was going on basically for years without her having any particular idea of what was happening.
Yeah, the ultimate deception, right? Like, it's
from the person she trusted the most, right? And also the kind of monstrous element that dozens of men were okay with doing this to her, came and did it. The handful, I think there were maybe 3 men who said, no, this is not for me. Didn't report it though, just walked away. And something attracted them to thinking about doing it in the first place. And so this could go on and on and on with the sort of complicity and the active participation of dozens of men in the community, or in the broader community within, you know, a few mile radius of where she lived. And I think that has struck such a chord with people who are questioning, what is this sort of almost monster that lives among us? This is not a Harvey Weinstein kind of case where you have this very, very powerful figure who's wielding their power in a very explicit way. You know, it's this sort of silent thing in it, you know, it's like there's this question mark of like, is this silent thing in all of our homes? You know, are there men walking among us? There's nothing.
Well, it's so relatable, isn't it? It's like, it could happen to it makes it feel like it could happen to anybody, right?
Well, it makes you think, well, these men walk among us. There's nothing special about this French town where this happened. There's nothing special about where she lived. And so there's this question of what is going on here, and why is this happening? Why are there men perfectly willing to rape an unconscious woman, and to think of that as something that is an acceptable thing to do in any way? And what conversations aren't we having? Because I also don't believe that it would be easy, right? And trust me, I've gotten into this myself, to go, men are just fucking trash. You know, like, what the fuck? Just keep them away from me. It easy to go down that route in a way, but this isn't normal and inherent in people. People aren't born abusers, and so it feels like this collective conversation which we should be having, and we're somehow not having here. And we're failing. I mean, we're obviously failing women in a very direct way, but it feels like we're failing everyone here. Like, we're failing society here.
yeah, it has a bigger impact, right? Like even just the notion, like there's so many, as you were speaking, I was just thinking there's so many structural stuff, like things that are so wrong that allowed for that to happen. The fact that not only were these men willing, like you said, to participate, even if they decided it wasn't for them not reporting it, but then her going to her doctors not being believed, or not even that she was being believed, but them not even thinking like that could be happening. Like it doesn't add up. And what was their assumptions around the reasons why did they not believe her? The trust piece is so important, right? It's so devastating. How would you trust anybody again? How would you trust any man again?
And also, I think that there's this conversation which has been happening for a number of years when we talk about this kind of issue. We talk about toxic masculinity and we talk about the extreme end of it, which is violence against women and girls. And you have that kind of, you have that not all men response. And so there's also this fragility in men often in having this conversation in the first place and in wanting to go, I distance myself from that. I'm one of the good guys. Don't have a go at me. And it's like, and this isn't a new question by any means, but there is this question of how can it be not all men when all women have had, it's widespread enough that it's all women, but somehow we're supposed to believe that it's this pocket of monstrous individuals. And it feels like as a society where I don't want to sound like I'm sort of pandering to men in any way on this, but it feels like we're not just deeply failing women, we're failing men. And it feels like because we can't have this conversation often, if you think about, I was thinking about when we were doing the research for this, how many men I've seen post about this, like basically none. All of the things that I read online about not just this case, but about toxic masculinity in general, about the need to fight it, all that kind of stuff, all comes from women.
Because of toxic masculinity, right? Like not showing vulnerability, like subscribing to that hierarchy, whether it's subconscious or not. I think you can attribute a lot of that, like not engaging with that, right? It's all part of it.
So it's like it's kind of that the snake that's eating its own tail. It's like part of this feels fueled by the fact that men are not conditioned to talk about stuff, and then when these issues emerge or are in the news, or men are also the ones not talking about them. And sort of relatedly, but a slight side note is I was talking to my partner about some of the work I'm doing to build communities in an organization, and I was like, I think we need a men's community, and she was absolutely mortified. She was like, men need a community, and like, but we had this kind of interesting, expansive debate and conversation around the fact that actually men need to talk, and the women's community and being an ally to women somehow doesn't feel like it's going to achieve that. And so what conversations are men not having with each other that feel part of this universe of things? Because I feel like there's that extreme end of violence and abuse and that kind of thing, but then there's also what feels related to this broad conversation for me is things like the epidemic of male suicide, for instance, right? Like suicide is the number one killer of men who die under the age of 45 in the UK. Why is that happening? That feels related to me in the sense that we're not talking about vulnerability. We're not talking about mental health. We're not talking about depression. Where all of these things are sort of taboo and pushed under the surface. And then there's a question of, as long as anything becomes so deeply taboo, it's pushed and never talked about, it curdles into something quite poisonous, right?
Yeah, sinister. And I think one of the things that I think we've talked about this on previous podcasts, that I came away from for Black boys was that's the first time I'd ever seen Black men talking about their feelings in that way, and different Black men from different backgrounds, upbringings, lived experiences, talking about things that would and openly embracing each other. And that's not to say that it doesn't happen, but I think this idea of and it happens across the board, not just with Black men, but this idea of like lack of vulnerability, not having any vulnerabilities, is all part of one of the the overemphasis and value placed on kind of these stereotypical like maleness, masculine things that you're meant to have to be a good man: toughness, power, aggression. And I think that lack of vulnerability is one of the most dangerous. Not showing your emotions, not dealing with your emotions, not being able to articulate how you're feeling, not being able to read how other people are feeling, having low emotional EQ, low EQ, all those things, like you said, they curdle into something that is really sinister. And a lot of the time, there's lots of mental health issues that are attached to just this in itself, like the toxic masculinity. And if we don't have that conversation, we don't deal with it. We don't deal with toxic masculinity if we don't deal with what's causing it. And that involves a conversation about and with men.
And to what extent do you think, because there's something you said earlier around, this is the tip of the iceberg and we're just seeing it now. And that made me think of how when there was a kind of Black Lives Matter explosion of activism in 2020, which wasn't the beginning of Black Lives Matter, that began more like 2014. But there's sort of that moment in time where everyone was having that discussion around state violence against Black people, and this sort of kind of collective, how did we not know about this problem? I'm speaking in the voice of a white person right now. And a lot of people in the Black community saying, this has been the reality. So this has been the reality for a long time. You're just seeing it now. There's a question for me here of how much has this just been the reality and we didn't know? How many Dominique Pellicos have just exist and we had no fucking clue? And that this has just been a feature. And just the way that news works now means we're seeing it. And how much of this is changing and shifting and becoming more extreme? Because, I was reading an article that said from this year, I think from July, saying the National Police Chiefs Council, which is interesting. I'm always interested to quote police data because I always think that's probably going to be underreported in and of itself. But the National Police Chiefs Council has described violence against women and girls as a national emergency. And 2 million women a year are estimated to be victims of violence perpetrated by men.
And just to add to that as well, like Refuge had some stats as well. And one of them that really shocked me was specifically younger women. So 41% of UK girls aged 14 to 17 in an intimate relationship experience some form of sexual violence from their partner. 41%. Already at that young age, some of those behaviours, the toxic masculinity and all that kind of stuff is already ingrained as young as 14 and is being played out. Sexual violence, are you crazy?
Well, to refer back to almost some personal context, I think that I've spoken to female friends about this, and I think almost every woman I know, certainly every woman I know that I've spoken to about this kind of thing on a personal level, has experienced sexual violence of some form, to some degree, myself included. And I think that there's an interesting, like so many things, like I think, I've had a racial awakening over time as well. I think a lot of women, my childhood was in the 90s and I was a teenager in the noughties, to like deeply toxic eras for women and women's bodies. And you know, you think about even basic things like how we treated Britney Spears, you know, like this was just a toxic time, and the messages we were being fed were horrific.
Well, just on that Britney Spears point in itself, like dressing up as a schoolgirl.
Well, dressing up as a schoolgirl, and but also like the sort of, you know, I don't know if you've watched any of the Britney Spears documentaries, but some of the interrogations she got about purity and virginity and whether or not she was it was just like disgusting, actually. Disgusting. So, you know, you're growing up in that kind of era, and I think you don't actually even know yourself what constitutes something that's not okay. So there's a conditioning that happens. I mean, I hope that's changed in the sort of 20 years since I was 15.
Well, I mean, yeah, hopefully these numbers are going down, but I don't think they are.
I don't think they are going down, but I also wonder if we're better reporting. There's also that question of like, as a 15-year-old girl or 14-year-old girl, I wouldn't have known to call and to name anything, even to be part of a statistic in the first place, if that makes sense.
You're just making me think about like when I was, and I think we were probably in similar years at school, but like the emphasis was the issue with teenage pregnancies was like a big thing, but it was very much focused on the woman.
Yeah. It was like, don't get yourself pregnant.
Oh, they're just doing it for houses. All these like women, girls doing it for houses. It's like,
yes, I'm going to bring a whole human into the world to get a house somehow.
Yeah.
But yeah, and that kind of narrative that anyway, getting pregnant is somehow a woman's thing that happens, and she does it on her own. This is immaculate conception. So it's hard to kind of know whether it's getting worse or it's getting more visible, or there is some kind of radicalization that is happening now, which perhaps wasn't happening before. I mean, obviously one of the kind of consistent debates about the internet is how it's brought people a sense of connection across geographies and across, you know, across the world. And at the same time, if you're a violent incel in your parents' basement, you know, back in 20 years ago, you wouldn't have found community with other violent incels located in different countries throughout the world. So that can also fuel it can fuel movements, both positive and negative. I don't know what the answer is, but it seems like on the radicalization point, where we're catching up too late. You know, the conversation, like schools, for instance, and the conversation around catching young boys when they're going deep into these online rabbit holes feels like it's happening too late.
Yeah, and I think also, and I think it's struggling to keep up, right? Like I think technology is moving so quickly, and people's access to content, and not saying that the internet is the reason why all of this is happening, but people's parents' ability to set constraints around those types of things and keep up with the technology to be able to do that is moving at a pace that is hard for anybody to be able to keep up with. And even from a governmental perspective and societal perspective, it's hard to keep up. Everything's changing so quickly.
We've spoken a little bit about the sort of French court case that's happening at the moment, but a couple of things that are interesting. I looked back through, in advance of this recording, I looked back through a presentation I gave, I think a year ago or so, maybe just over a year ago, about gender, and about it was broadly about a lot of things to do with gender. But one of the things it touched on was gender-based violence. And I looked at that. I've got this slide, right, that shows the epidemic of gender-based violence, and it was the BBC News homepage. I've got a screenshot of the BBC News homepage from the 7th of February 2023, and every single top news story is about sexual violence. And so I was thinking, oh, this feels really, really, really prevalent right now in this moment, October 2024. And then I went back to my slides from February 2023, which is a year and a half ago. And literally, I'll read you out the top things. Teacher and daughter shot by husband, police believe. Serial rapist Carrick jailed for at least 30 years. Dad guilty of disabled daughter's manslaughter. Man arrested over 11-year-old girl's disappearance. Like, it's just unbelievable. Like, I mean, this is literally in the bit that says most read, and it's all the different news stories. And so what I'm saying is, I was thinking in this moment, which is a year and a bit on, God, it feels like it's everywhere right now. And it didn't feel... And then I looked back and I was like, God, it was everywhere 18 months ago as well. I mean, we think about not only the court case that we've spoken about, Rebecca Cheptegei murdered by her partner, set alight. I mean, Jesus, the horror with which some of these women are killed as well. Over a dispute over some land, I think. There's a former Miss Switzerland model called Christina Joksimovic, who was killed and put in a blender by her partner a month or two ago. There was the crossbow attacks. I don't know if you remember. That was in July. The woman, mother and two daughters who were killed. And again, this was a man who I think was the ex-boyfriend of one of the daughters.
There's another element to it, sorry. It's just like the intention feels very different when you're like the intention and the motive and what you're getting out of it. It feels like they're getting something out of that, right? Like, why would you choose to, your worst enemy, burn somebody alive? Like, that is inflicting so much pain.
Well, I think there's one of the features of some of these, for me at least, feels like an entitlement to women as some kind of less than human property. Like somehow you're entitled to me, and if I reject you, you kill me because I'm property in crude terms to you, or I don't have a right to my own kind of sense of independence. I don't have a right to my own stuff. I don't have a right to my own life. And so how do we pull apart and start to break down this narrative that, let's be honest, in all of these cases we're talking about cis het men, seem to have about women and the right women have to, because this is the whole phenomenon of incels as well, right? Like, women don't have the right to tell you they don't want to have sex with you. Somehow you have a right to ownership over women and women's bodies. And I don't know if that's a case of what men always thought they had this, and now we're living in a societal moment where that's not okay anymore, and there's a sort of backlash against it. So a little bit like,
yeah, it's like, where are we? What are we? Which way are we going? Is it like getting worse, or are we just realizing it, and we're at an inflection point where it's like, okay, no, this is really not good, and we're recognizing it. That's why it's bubbling up, or we're seeing it more and we're acknowledging it more.
Well, I think there's also a question about, to that point, one of the things I'm sort of wondering is how much there feels like there's been a sort of Me Too backlash, right? Like, for the first time, women started talking about the prevalence of the experience of abuse or sexual violence or discomfort around things they'd experienced at the hands of, I mean, we're talking mostly about abuse. It's just a continuum of how serious. And it feels a little bit like there's been a sort of, no, get back. We don't want to have that breakthrough moment. And that happens a lot. If you look through the course of history, that happens a lot with movements that pick up speed and that challenge the previous status quo. You had it with the civil rights movement, you had it with the gay rights movement. The women's rights movement has obviously been going on a very long time, but this moment in that movement, post, when was Me Too? 2017-ish? A little while ago now. Of this moment in the sort of history of women's rights struggle feels like there has been a very explicit backlash against.
Like, has there been that realization that power has been taken back in some way, or it looks to be shifting in a different direction? Are women more empowered? Are they more believed? Are things starting to change in a direction that's nowhere near where it should be? But is the reaction is it possibly a reaction to that acknowledgement?
I've got this fantastic article saved in my phone, and it's called "The Female Price of Male Pleasure," and it's from about 5 years ago, and I've just had it saved for 5 years because it's so good. And it's explicitly about sex, but it's about the differences between men and women in particular when it comes to sex. And one of the really interesting sort of things that it talks about is when we talk about one of the things that they talk about up front in the article is the controversy about Aziz Ansari from a few years ago. I don't know if you remember, there was some controversy about a woman who he went on a date with, and it was a kind of nuanced story because she left feeling uncomfortable type of thing.
Was that a comedian?
Yes. Yeah. And so there was a lot of debate about whether, well, if she felt uncomfortable, why didn't she just leave? And that kind of conversation was happening about it. And one of the things they talk about in this article is that we need to talk more about what women's thresholds for uncomfortable are, and what women see as, like, what the sort of scale looks like. And one of the things she talks about a lot, basically, is how women view sex on a scale of like 1 to 10. Women think of bad sex as painful and often don't talk to their male partners, about it being painful. So bad sex for a woman, and how women interpret bad sex, is pain. Men, and how men interpret bad sex, is boring. So the scale of what we're talking about when we use words like discomfort,
so depressing,
is so vastly different for women and men. One of the things that she says in the article is women are enculturated to be uncomfortable most of the time and to ignore their discomfort. Large proportions of women don't tell their partner when sex hurts. When women talk about bad sex, they're talking about physical pain. When men talk about bad sex, they're talking about passivity, a boring experience.
Their wants and needs not being satisfied.
Yeah. There's a woman she quotes who's a professor at the Indiana University School of Public Health called Debbie Herbenick. And she says the same thing. She says, when it comes to quote unquote good sex, women often mean without pain, and men often mean they had orgasms. And so there's this whole culture which women form part of as well, and are kind of in, and with the water that we're swimming in as well, is that when you feel discomfort, when you feel pain, when you feel uncomfortable, you don't necessarily say anything about it. And I think that also is in some way contributing to this culture in which we're not able to talk about.
It essentially ingrains and normalizes the fact that pleasure comes with pain. So anything that's good, of course, there's going to be parts of it that are not. And like one of the facts from the Refuge article, they've got an article about facts. The facts that tell a clear story is it takes on average 7 attempts before a woman is able to leave for good. Leaving an abusive partner is a process, not a single act. I think that kind of ties into some of the things that you're saying. It just reminded me of that specific fact around, the fact that it takes 7 attempts. It's got bad enough to try and leave 6 times before you actually do decide to leave, because obviously something.
Well, I think in those cases they are leaving. So with the 7 attempts, it's not that they are literally leaving 7 times, not not they kind of think about it, and then leave. And so that's also if I try and leave, I don't know if you've seen the Netflix, this has just popped into my mind as well, the Netflix drama Maid. She's in an abusive relationship in that. It's really good, actually. It's from a year ago or so, I think. And she's in an abusive relationship, and you see how hard it is to leave. Not for want of trying, not because she doesn't want to leave or whatever, but how logistically and physically hard it is to do so when your partner is abusive and when you basically don't have any structural support to leave.
There's a level of acceptance of these situations in terms of you just made me think about it when you said there's that you don't necessarily have the support or the structure to leave, of people kind of turning a blind eye to a situation, or just being or normalizing it. Oh yeah, it happened to me. It's normal. It happens to all of us. You just sometimes need to just not annoy him so much.
I think there's a few things. I think poverty plays a part. I think women who don't have a lot of resources, don't have a lot of support from the police, for instance, who we know is an inherently misogynistic institution in and of itself. Domestic violence isn't taken seriously. When women call the police in abusive situations, often they then get punished by their partners for calling the police, and the police don't particularly help. You see lots and lots of cases of women who've had stalkers and things like that, and it's not really considered stalking for a really long time, and the burden of proof for it being stalking is kind of high, and so there's all of that structural stuff which I don't think is in place. And I think that women who have less resources are not, this is just generally true of people, it's not taken seriously or supported seriously, or seen as people who deserve the same level of protection as women of means, let's say. And then I think but then I think that's part of the broader culture of around women, which is you're sort of thought of as you should sort of take it. Women are used to pain. Women are expected to take pain. Women are expected to sort of endure, I think. And that's a sort of societal expectation, which we're pushing against. But I think then this backlash comes from pushing against. One of the things I thought, yeah, this 100% resonates from that female price of male pleasure article, was she said, PubMed has almost 5 times as many clinical trials on male sexual pleasure as it has on female sexual pain. And why? Because we live in a culture that sees female pain as normal and male pleasure as a right. And so I think that's sort of an encapsulation of part of what we're talking about here. I think we could talk about this topic all day long, and I think there are facets of this topic we haven't even touched on, but I think it's been an interesting start of a conversation around what contributes to this phenomenon and part of what we can maybe start to do about it.
Yeah. I think I completely agree. And I think there's so many nuances and things that we can talk about in terms of misogyny and how it shows itself in so many different situations. And I think we should definitely talk about it more.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Impolite Company.
If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe to our show and share it far and wide with anyone you think will benefit.
And if you'd like to connect with us directly, we're on LinkedIn as Kieran Scott Woodhouse and Ella McCann Tomlin.
We'll be back soon.